morning and good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this keynote session from the World Humanitarian Forum, a commitment to leaving no one behind. My name is Alexandra Bilak. I'm the director of IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center here in Geneva. We are a center of expertise which provides data and insight on the issue of internal displacement. And as such, I'm very glad to be moderating today's panel, as at IDMC we firmly believe that solutions to displacement need to be found and embedded in national and global agendas for sustainable development. So this is a very timely and relevant session for me to be moderating. I'd like to briefly describe the topic of today's session. This keynote session focuses precisely on how to find long-term solutions to displacement and how to build these solutions on collaborative approaches, strategic partnership, solidarity, and of course, accountability. The session is built on the assumption that reaching the SDGs will require both state and non-state actors to work together and to build strong coalitions that match the scale of the challenge that we face today. Our panelists are here today to talk about how this can work in practice, particularly when we look at the specific challenges that have been brought on by current displacement and migration trends. The panelists will be discussing some of these challenges, and they'll be focusing on the types of support needed today to resolve what has been referred to by many as a global crisis. Our discussion will cover government responses and policies, but also the important role of multilateral organizations, NGOs, the private sector, and the media. We'll be asking ourselves a few key questions. First, are we doing enough to help those who are fleeing war, but also economic hardship and environmental change? Then can we somehow change the narrative so that they are adequately protected, so that they're welcomed, and so that they're supported? And finally, how can we leverage and engage new partners on the international scene to play a catalytic role in tackling this challenge? So I'm joined today by a very eminent panel of experts on this topic. I'm honored to be joined today by four people. First is Francesco Rocca, who's the president of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. Welcome, Francesco. Then we have Kelly Clements, Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, also joining, I believe, from Geneva, as Francesco is. Heggenes, who's the CEO of the IKEA Foundation, and if I may add, is also a panelist right now on the high-level panel on internal displacement. And Sherrie Westin, who's the president of Social Impact and Philanthropy for Sesame Workshop, which is the non-profit educational organization behind the famous TV show Sesame Street. So welcome to all of you. It's an honor to have you with me today. I'd like to start by giving you all the floor just for some short opening remarks, very short, 3 minutes each, before we can then go into some more specific questions on the topic for today. So I'd like to start with you, Francesco. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for inviting me to this panel with focus on the refugee crisis and how we go about changing the narrative in times of COVID-19. The topic is extremely relevant and very timely, as migrants belong to a group with an exponential increase of vulnerability in times of crisis. The pandemic and its health, social economic implications on the society and on the individual is no exception. As president of the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Society, which is 192 members in almost every country of the world, I have a unique and global insight into the situation in countries of origin, transit, and destination to our millions of volunteers that work on a daily basis in supporting and caring for vulnerable migrants, refugees, and displaced. On the routes from Libya to Italy, from Panama to Central America, Western Africa, or Bangladesh, our volunteers in the field are eyewitness to a terrible situation. In COVID-19 times, they see the growing suffering of people, including poverty, lack of access to basic services, and increasing stigmatization. And COVID-19 is a global disaster that impacts everyone, but for migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, it has been an absolute catastrophe. In this period, they are more than ever discriminated, and too many times are forgotten in the debate. While the world attention is turned towards COVID-19, we cannot forget the vulnerability of thousands of people fleeing their homes to the climate crisis, armed conflicts, violence, food insecurity, just to name a few of the reasons. 2 weeks ago, we launched a policy report called Least Protected, Most Affected, Migrants and Refugees Facing Extraordinary Risk During the COVID-19. With this report, we are calling on governments to increase migrant access to essential services, particularly healthcare, and to ensure access for aid groups, including our Red Cross represent national societies. We have a lot of examples of people of forgotten, people of neglected crises. Let me just remind Bosnia-Herzegovina is one of them, just very close here for Italy. Libya is still a forgotten crisis. We only talk about Libya only when we engage with in this kind of discussion and discussing with other colleagues of the humanitarian field, but it has disappeared from the headlines of our media, while the level of suffering in the country is something unbelievable. It is increasing and increasing because this crisis related to the COVID-19 and other areas. But what struck me the most is that the fact that I started my volunteers part at the end of the 80s, more than 30 years ago, in Italy, and we received migrants from the Horn of Africa. Back then, we started to discuss migration influxes, how to better deal with this phenomenon, and for 30 years, we had talked about helping in countries of origin. And I have to admit that in 30 years, not much has changed. And although we have many resolutions that aims at improving the situation for migrants, we see that the debate has remained the same, or maybe it has worsened, because now the migration is part, and the refugees situation is part of this very polarized discussion that is happening more or less in every country with no exception. So let me finish this brief introduction with our call to action. First, all migrants, irrespective of legal status, must be given access to essential services, particularly healthcare, and everyone should have access to screening, testing, tracing, and treatment without fear of arrest, detention, or deportation. We have been saying this for years, but still action is far too slow. The COVID-19 pandemic has added this urgency. Second, measures to control COVID-19 cannot be used to justify inhuman treatment of migrants and refugees. They must not impact the ability to seek asylum or force people to return to a situation of danger and harm. In some countries, we have seen the principle of non-refoulement be discounted with no benefit to public health. And third, we call on our authorities to cooperate with the Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies and other humanitarian groups and guarantee them humanitarian space and access so that they can provide critical aid to migrants in need. COVID-19 affects everyone equally, but the most vulnerable people, such as migrants, are the most at risk. And these people are least able to access healthcare and most impacted by loss of income. But they must not be forgotten. We are doing our utmost not to leave anyone behind, but we also need a strong political will. And when it comes to COVID-19, no one of us is safe until we are all safe. And this means we also need to direct our support to the vulnerable group, such as migrants, which are suffering the most. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for these opening remarks, which have set the scene already very well. I'm going to hand over now to Kelly for a few opening remarks too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and I'm delighted to be with the other panelists, dear friends. A couple of things to set the stage. First, 1% of the world's population is displaced, forcibly displaced, or violence, persecution, environmental factors, a complexity of issues. 100 million people have been displaced in the last decade, which is a doubling. It's a young population. 2/3 of that population of refugees, which are about 30 million people, come from just 5 countries, from South Sudan, from Myanmar, from Afghanistan, from Syria, and from Venezuela. We have, at the moment, one of the I think something that people think is that refugees in particular are in camps. Most are not. Most are in urban settings. 85% are in developing countries. And 73% of refugees stay very close to home. They're in the neighboring countries. So with that as a context, in terms of your questions, Alex, in terms of setting the stage, what has happened since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, where we really talked about new ways of working? How do we bring different partnerships together? How is it that we look at forced displacement with a sense of solidarity, that it's everybody's responsibility, not just the host countries or the communities that have been supporting them for decades, because most have been protracted for many, many years and several generations. In 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees was adopted. What does this do? This brings a whole of society approach together to ease the pressure on host communities, to find solutions to displacement, and to look at refugees and as not as beneficiaries, but as agents of their own change, where they are in the driver's seat in terms of those responsibilities. And it looked at partnerships in an entirely different way. Last year, just before this year changed everything, we had a global refugee forum, which brought together 3,000 different entities with 1,400 different pledges and commitments from all walks of our society: international financial institutions, organizations, governments, communities, private sector, academia, and so on. So there is a real potential now that we can change the narrative, that we can find solutions to displacement with different partnerships, and that we can look at what is really critically important in terms of providing the tools for people to find their own solutions: jobs, education, digital identity, inclusion, not separateness, but inclusion in national plans, be it health, education, etc., and the way that, again, people that are displaced can take their lives into their own hands. Thank you very much for having this important topic on your plate today.
Great, thanks a lot, Kelly. I think already a lot of really interesting and good insights into how to change that narrative and shift the conversation on this issue. Handing over to Per also for a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks for having me. As you know, at the IKEA Foundation, we're working to create a better future for the many children. That's our focus. And we believe the key to that better future is ensuring that families have access to both financial stability and a healthy planet. And often I think about what Martin Luther King once said. He said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I want us to keep that in mind during this discussion. I believe this is the moment to acknowledge that life should not return to the way it was before COVID-19 hit. This is really our chance to build a better future, and a future where no one is left behind. So I hope that in a few years, when we look back at 2020, we will remember this year as the turning point, a massive reset in how humanity collectively tackles issues like inequality and injustice, but also climate change, because they're all interlinked. It all works together. So I think it's our collective responsibility to address the humanitarian crisis that force families to flee their homes. But we also have to address the conditions that perpetuate human suffering in the first place, the root causes that lead to displacement, whether it's conflict or climate change, or just lack of opportunities to make a living. I think we can only achieve that through unprecedented collaboration across all sectors of society, the governments, development organizations, the UN, of course, philanthropy, grassroots movements, and the private sector. And I believe the private sector has a huge role to play in this. So that's what we support at IKEA Foundation, and I'm grateful that I will get the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Per. And I'll be coming back to that, how to actually make leaving no one behind a reality. So thanks, excellent opening remarks. Over to you, Sherrie.
I first want to thank you for having me, and it is a pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel. As you mentioned, Sesame Workshop is the nonprofit behind Sesame Street, which most people do know. And we have been focused on reaching children in their critical early years for over 50 years. And, you know, it's because we always felt like that's where we could have the greatest return on investment and the greatest impact, but now we have the science to prove it. We also use the power of media to reach children wherever they may be. And in many of those places, it's where children have no other means of quality early learning. So given the numbers that Kelly talked about in terms of the number of people displaced today, almost half of whom are children, we knew that Sesame had a role to play to reach these children. And the thing that I think is most sort of stunning to me in getting into the humanitarian space was that as much evidence as we have today in terms of the return on investment when we reach children in those critical early years, you know, it's when a child's brain grows the fastest than any other time in those first 5 years of life, yet less than 3% of all humanitarian aid, it goes to education, and only a tiny sliver to early learning. So we also know that when we can reach children in those early years and when we can provide nurturing care, more engagement with a caring adult, it is the most effective thing to help mitigate the debilitating effect that prolonged exposure to stress and trauma has on a child's healthy brain development. So that's why we formed a partnership with the International Rescue Committee. We knew we couldn't do it alone because Sesame, while we can create proven educational content, we're not a direct service provider. In forming the partnership with the IRC, we knew we could be able to reach children both with mass media and direct services, and we focused on the Syrian response region. Now, some may know that led to incredible sort of groundbreaking investments and by the MacArthur Foundation and the LEGO Foundations, which is allowing us to create the largest early childhood intervention and humanitarian response. And it is by working with the IRC, by working with BRAC, because we're also working in the Rohingya crisis, we're trying to combine a model where we have mass media to reach children at scale, but we also have content, learning materials, exercises, curriculum, so that our partners, like the IRC and BRAC, have these tools to reach children directly through home visits, through learning centers, through clinics. And obviously that has been tremendously impacted by the pandemic because we can't reach them in person. But I think that speaks to the importance of educational media. Thank goodness that's what we can do. And so we've redoubled our efforts, not just television, but digital and mobile and YouTube and WhatsApp, you name it, so that we can still reach these children and families with valuable tools to promote engagement, to promote learning, to promote playful learning when we can't be there in person. And the only other thing I'd like to mention is that research is so critically important in this. We are investing a tremendous amount, our partner with NYU, Global Ties, to create a body of research on what's most effective for children in crisis settings. There's a dearth of research on that. And by doing this, we'll literally double the amount that's available to everyone because we want people to learn from what works, learn from our mistakes, and this to be a catalyst for this model to be used for displaced children wherever they may be. We're shifting that a bit too. We have to pivot, but we're now researching the impact of this distance learning, of these mobile contacts, so that we can still learn from that for the future. Because, you know, sadly, even after the pandemic, I think there's going to be tremendous value for us to know what was most effective in distance learning and to be able to use that in you know, future crises and beyond.
Thank you very much, Sherrie. Some extremely important points that you've made about some of the most vulnerable groups out there, being children, some of the access issues that you've also mentioned, which we'll also come back to. So thank you all very much for these introductory remarks. I'm going to actually shift the order of the questions that I had prepared, and I'd like to actually perhaps start by pausing on the current state of our operating environment, this collective operating environment that we're all in right now with the global COVID-19 pandemic. And perhaps this could be a question to you, Kelly. As you said, and as has been said by other panelists, the pandemic has already had many widespread and negative impacts on vulnerable communities across the world. Could you say a few words about how you see this affecting our ability to continue reaching the most vulnerable? And how do you think we need to factor a longer-term presence of this pandemic into how we think about achieving the SDGs and of course, achieving solutions for displaced communities over the next decade?
Thanks. Unmuted this time. Yeah, important question, and obviously what's hanging over all of us, including the reasons why we're on this call with you as opposed to where we were last year, being together in person for something like this. It's really changed everything, as the president said. We have a socioeconomic crisis of historical proportions. We have a global economy in meltdown. We have a very small number of wealthy members of this international community getting wealthier, and we see inequalities only increasing. And who are amongst the most marginalized? As Mr. Rocca said, it is by and large those forcibly displaced migrants, others that depend on livelihoods and depend on the kindness, generosity in many cases of others and of the host communities where they find themselves. The loss in jobs and economic livelihoods, the school closures, to get to the point that Sherrie has made in terms of early learners, the 1.2 billion learners that right now have no access to an education, even remotely because of connectivity or other barriers to that education. And you see certainly some crises in terms of protection with regard to the inability in some parts of the world of those that are in need of protection from persecution of crossing borders because access is unavailable, travel opportunities are limited, and the focus is strongly on health. Now, the international community, and certainly those of us in the humanitarian community, I think it's quite extraordinary how much we've turned on a dime in terms of being able to support and use some of our existing programs to reinforce governments and local communities that tried to get information out quickly, basics of hand washing and sanitation, the health facilities that would be required for those members of the communities that had the infection, became very ill. And those sorts of things in terms of reinforcement, we had some structures in place. But as this continues, and now we're in the 7th, 8th, 9th month of it, our big concern is that some of those protection and restrictions on movement that were put into places by governments from a health perspective, that those don't get baked in to the future in terms of the inability of people to be able to find safety. That we don't see an socioeconomic package or a social safety net that is only related to citizens of a country, but that also includes those that may not be nationals of that country. That we see health systems, and this is where the inclusion narrative has been very important, that governments have by and large recognized they can't just protect their own citizens, but they have to protect others because that's necessary to protect their own. And that inclusion, as time goes on, I think there is a danger that that is fragile and starts to dissipate a bit. So the inclusion agenda becomes an important one, especially from the health perspective, but also from the economic perspective. So from every facet of this, there are long-term implications that if we don't have the kinds of partnerships that I think you were starting to lay out at the beginning of this discussion firmly into place, that we're not going to be able to protect, and we will see people left behind.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I think, of course, the perspective that you're giving is already a bleak one, because we're looking at an immediate emergency, urgent needs that need to be addressed, but we're already projecting into the future and looking at some of the longer term socioeconomic impacts that will also have to be addressed and monitored carefully over the next few months. And perhaps I'd like to turn to Francesco on this point in particular. Again, trying to see how we can make no one left behind more than just a slogan. I think we also need to acknowledge that much of the displacement that we're seeing today isn't just caused by conflict or insecurity, as you were saying. There are a number of equally important factors now at play. Of course, the global COVID pandemic is exacerbating many of the vulnerabilities, but we're also seeing hugely relevant factors like environmental change, socioeconomic inequality driving yes, I mean, very much shaping these displacement trends. Do you feel, from your perspective as president of IFRC, do you feel that as a collective we are successfully tackling the multiple drivers of displacement? Have we actually got a good enough understanding of all the factors that are at play? And more importantly, how can we ensure that the people who are driven from their homes today, as well as those that are already today at risk of becoming displaced in the future, are actually factored into our planning and into our preparedness and our responses over the next decades? So this idea that we need to look at what is happening today, but we do need to have a much longer term perspective if we look at some of these structural issues at play.
Thank you, Alexandra. So it is a very complex question and not an easy answer from my perspective. I would say, and I like the statement of Per when he mentioned that we have to look to tomorrow, to be optimistic. Unfortunately, I think and I feel that what we are living now, due to the complexity and the multiple factors that are impacting on the most vulnerables, not only COVID-19, as you mentioned, this is the last call for grand bargain. Someone, I think Kelly, maybe mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit of 2016. And I think that we were so happy and so satisfied after the World Humanitarian Summit about the achievements. But then I'm realizing that we are very far from the concrete. Someone is starting to say that the Grand Barricade has failed. And the role of the local actors, what we wanted to achieve is very, very far to be a reality. So if you ask me if we are tackling enough, if we must be satisfied about the level of the answer, I'm not. And of course, this is because the level of support that is coming from the governments, from the political leaders, which are not paying attention, or maybe better, instead of paying attention to the most vulnerable, instead of paying attention to the fact that the health of everyone, of the lack of health to everyone can affect everyone in every place, they are pointing the migrants, the refugees, more and more, and they have become part of the political discussion, part of the polarization that we are living in our country, especially in the Western part of the world. And we are missing the strong support that we had in the past for those vulnerable communities. So for me, it's more about, I'm optimistic, as Per said, because I believe in the intimate nature of each human being in working for the good. So what we think is that we have to engage more in the discussion, like this at community level. Maybe we have to stop to try to discuss, to engage with political leaders that they don't want to listen. Sorry if I'm so rude on this, but the sense of frustration in talking about migrants after 30 years and more, working on same areas of crisis, in same people that is suffering, the same or even worse level of suffering, this is making me less optimistic about this kind of dialogue, while we had a lot of good experiences in working with the community, trying to change at community level the narrative, then each human being is able to recognize the human being in the migrants and the refugees. And here we have a lot of good examples of how we can work at community level in being inclusive, as you said, and maybe Kelly said, how important is the inclusion. So, and this is why, back to the point, is the last call to work with the local actors, with the communities, to engage with the communities and working with them about the threats and the several and multiple threats that our world is living. Because my concern, my fear, just to admit, my fear is that there is no will of the political leaders, the most important, that they can make the difference to pay enough attention. Instead, they are feeding the fears of the people. And this is something that is creating also a lot of problem in the having access in serving the migrants and the refugees at national level. And we have the experience in Italy that I could talk for hours about how has become difficult. We have moved, and Kelly knows it very, very well. In 2014, in 2015, if you came in Italy, it seems that the humanitarians were the heroes saving lives. Now they are the ones that have complicity with the smugglers, now moving exactly in the opposite side. So a reason more why we have to work with the community. And this is kind of fear that has been fed by the political leaders, unfortunately.
Thank you, Francesco. Very important points about the importance of local action and community-based approaches that clearly have been missing, I think, from approaches to date. Not to put you on the spot, Per, but I'm just wondering what you think about that. And in particular, you know, if we think about leaving no one behind, one of the things I think we need to think about is how do we address some of those root causes of this exclusion? How do we come to more inclusive approaches? And I think for that we need to understand what causes exclusion: socioeconomic inequality, discrimination, governance, you know, vulnerability of certain social groups. From your perspective, what do you see as more concrete and effective ways of supporting displaced communities to address some of those structural challenges? And in particular, do you see a specific role for the private sector to come in and perhaps be a connector between these sometimes disconnected, as Francesco said, government policies and the action of local communities and local actors?
Unmuting. I think he's making an extremely important point, because in every situation where we talk about displacement, might be people displaced because of conflict, or people displaced because of climate change or drought, or people are just displaced because they don't find any way to keep their families alive. The thing is, they get moved to a new sector, a new area, a new community, and it becomes a conflict with the new community. So what we have seen, having worked with refugee settings in 10 years, very closely with UNHCR and Kelly and her colleagues, is that if we can find a way to help the community to create a win-win situation, if we work with the people who are hosting the refugees or the displaced people, and we give them the same opportunity to develop their community and to share and collaborate, you can create a win-win situation that not only enables people to start a new life, because all refugees would like to is the opportunity to start a new life in a new country, or the internally displaced people in a new part of the country because they were forced to flee. All they want to do is have a job, feed a family, and live in peace. And that can only happen if we ensure that everyone can live in peace together, and everyone benefits from the resources that the international sector is providing. And I think we have to work to get to an inclusive approach. One of the things that really struck me, and which I can't really understand as somebody who spent most of my time in business, is this big divide between humanitarian and development, because most situations in displacement situations are protracted situations, and it requires short-term aid, of course, to keep people alive, but it requires much more of development work so that people can create those opportunities to re-establish themselves in a new area. And I don't see why that can be done in a more holistic way instead of separating this in two different worlds. We are certainly trying to do that. When we come to the private sector and the engagement of the private sector, I personally believe there's a huge opportunity to engage the private sector. And the private sector might be foundations like myself, or the company that funds the money that we can use as a foundation. It can be companies internationally, but we often forgot that the most powerful companies are probably those who are already existing in those communities. And if we can find a way to incentivize those companies to create jobs for people, I think that's one of the most sustainable things you can do, is create jobs in a community that enables everyone to thrive. The private sector has an important role to play there, but it has to be in collaboration with with government and organizations, and in a way that we can make it interesting for them and incentivize them to stay in for a long term. I can see from the work that we have done with Kelly and others that it's a dearth of long-term multi-year investments, and development doesn't happen overnight. You have to have the patience. You have to put in patient capital to invest in the development. So when we, for example, together developed actually a model, a new approach in the south of Ethiopia together 8 years ago, it's taken us 8 years to get to the point where we are today, where 200,000 refugees and 200,000 host community are actually working together in harmony, in collaboration, farming the land, building up businesses because of access to microfinance, because of access to energy, because of access to funds that have enabled them to turn desert land into land that can be used to farm all kinds of different healthy food. So I think it's taken a long time, but it's demonstrated that you can even move a government to go from an encampment policy to an integration policy if they see that everyone benefits. And I think the private sector can play an important role in that.
I think this is very important and echoes some of the discussions that are also happening right now in the high-level panel on internal displacement, which is about how to incentivize action, how to incentivize a more proactive and positive and catalytic role for local actors, private sector, as well as, of course, governments and their international counterparts. And we're asking ourselves a lot, what can be elements that can shift those incentive structures. And I'm just wondering, Per, if maybe you could jot down a few ideas. I'll come back to you because I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you could come back to us with a few ideas about what you think were some of those key incentives that made, the example that you gave in Ethiopia so successful, things that we should reflect on as actors and could possibly replicate elsewhere. I'd like to go to you, Sherrie, to also reflect on the full range of partnerships that are out there and that should be leveraged and tapped into and capitalized on to find solutions. I think we all agree that government-led solutions alone are not going to do the trick. That there's a huge wealth of expertise and ideas that can come from other actors, local all the way to local, national, and international. What would you say? I mean, what inspires you here when you think about that, and what do you think can be the role of an organization such as yours, and what have you learned actually from the engagement that you mentioned both in Syria and Bangladesh with organizations like IRC, and particularly when you think about reaching those most vulnerable and marginalized groups like children? What are some of the key lessons learned that we could
Well, I think first and foremost that we couldn't do it alone. And as I mentioned earlier, because we aren't a direct service organization, we knew we needed a partner that knew as much about refugees and the needs of refugees as we knew about educational media. So I think, we've often said in our work that it's the power of media and the power of Muppets, but it's also the power of partnerships. And as I mentioned in our model, it is not only the mass media, the educational content, but those direct services. And even working with IRC and BRAC, it's so important that we, have a big umbrella, if you will. I mean, in fairness, it was UNHCR that helped with the first pilot that Sesame did in the Rohingya space. We know that the more we can work together with others and complement our skill sets, the more effective we can be. I mentioned the funding of MacArthur and Lego Foundations, and I think what was so groundbreaking about that is most grants in this space tend to be short. And I think Per alluded to this, for us to have the ability to plan for 5 years and to be flexible is hugely important as we have to respond. The other thing I would say is that we can't scale without government. So here we have philanthropists that are moving into a humanitarian space in a big way, which is fantastic. We have an ability to partner with NGOs and actors in the humanitarian space. And then, for example, in Jordan, We're working with the Ministry of Education to embed the programs and content we've created into a Ready to Learn and school program. And if we're going to be sustainable and if we're going to scale, we have to be able to work with those governments as well. You know, I'm so pleased we'll be able to do research and really be able to show efficacy. And hopefully that will help make the case for these models to be replicated elsewhere, and for us to be able to expand to reach children wherever they are. There's a lot we learn. You know, it's not as simple as creating a model and it will just, you know, work everywhere. We do believe the combination of reaching children at scale and direct services and promoting engagement and nurturing care is critical. But we also now know how important it is to be culturally sensitive to adapt these programs. I mean, the setting, as everyone here well knows, in Bangladesh, in the Rohingya, in Cox's Bazar is very different than that in the Syrian response region in so many ways, in terms of media penetration, socioeconomic status, government rules and involvement, and even the vulnerabilities that children face. So we have to start with research. We have to make sure we're doing thorough analysis, but we do still believe that if we can be reaching the youngest victims of displacement, we have the greatest chance of putting them back on a path for success.
Thank you very much. Sherrie, could you perhaps just say a few extra words about how you plan to make that kind of intervention scalable? You talked about the importance of course, embedding some of those approaches in official sort of government policies. Concretely, what kind of lesson could you share with us there?
Well, you know, one of the things as I said, investing in the research to prove that this model is effective. I mean, it's based on proven programs, Reach Up and Learn and others to promote nurturing care. But for us to be there and to reach the number of children we hope to reach, we've got to be in other programs other than just Sesame and IRC. We know that. The other thing that's so important, and I'm so pleased with, is, again, adding this body of research to help be a catalyst and inform others in other spaces. It doesn't have to be Sesame. We're already seeing people starting to focus on early childhood. I do believe MacArthur was a catalyst for Lego. I do believe there are so many more players now that are recognizing the importance of those critical early years. You know, they don't have a chance of flourishing. I mean, given all that a child has gone through that experienced displacement, whether it's climate, whether it's conflict, whatever the reason, I think it's so ironic that those that are impacted the greatest in terms of their lifetime, what the impact it has on those first 5 years, receive the least. And we want to give children the chance to thrive, but also to rebuild their societies. So without that investment in early learning, I really think we're at a huge risk in terms of building a more peaceful, stable world. We're also leveraging our learnings, leveraging the content we're creating so that it can be used elsewhere. You know, the idea is to reach as many children as we can and to motivate and inspire others that this can make a difference, that there is a huge void, but there's also a huge opportunity.
Excellent, many thanks. I think it's really important to also remind ourselves of the importance of learning from proven success and sharing that good practice from one sector to another. So thanks a lot, Sherrie. Per, dare I come back to you for a few just extra thoughts on those catalytic factors, or whatever we want to call them, incentives that you would say were really promising from your work?
Absolutely, very happy to do that, Alex. And to follow up on what you just said, the program that we did with UNHCR and the Ethiopian government in Dolowado in the south of Ethiopia has been studied by the Oxford Refugee Studies Center, and an evaluation report is available. And that's an example of how we have invested in taking the learnings that we made together over the 8 years and turn it into a report that can be shared with anyone. And I think that's extremely important because we don't need all of us to make the same mistakes over and over again. The success factors, which you can partly read about in this report, but I'll give you 3 points that I think were absolutely critical. the first point is really the fact that from the very first day, we started involving both the refugees and the host community in the design of the programs. They were our customers, and we needed to understand from them what would work for them, what would we work in terms of collaboration, how would they be able to work together as opposed to live in this harmony where refugees are always treated worse than the host community. We really were successful in designing programs together with UNHCR because of that. Secondly, I think the second most important part of the success here is the fact that we took the time and the people to actually involve the local community, the formal and informal structures, the clients, the government at the national and regional level, because you can't make any of these things work in a local community like this unless you have everyone on your side and you create a situation where there's a win-win situation and people understand that this is good for everyone. So that understanding and that time that was invested in actually getting everyone to join in was extremely important, because on the contrary, they could have basically ruined everything if we hadn't had them on our side. In this, I would also say that the ability to work with a team at UNHCR that was willing to think outside of the box, were willing to go from providing the traditional aid and support to actually joining us in a journey to turn this into a situation where refugees and host community can work towards self-reliance, was a turning point and required really development work in a humanitarian situation. And that's not something that normally happens, but the ability to actually do that with a partner who's willing to do that was key. And I would say the third and most important part maybe is the long-term investment we made. You can't do this in short-term blocks. You can't do this year by year. This is development work in a very difficult setting, and you can only do that if you're willing to really spend the time and spend the money and be patient in making things work. So I think those were the most important factors. And I wanted to add to the end, when we talk about the private sector, that there's a misunderstanding often among governments and organizations about how to involve the private sector. You don't go to the private sector and ask them for money. That's not the best thing you can do. The best thing you can get from the private sector is their networks, their expertise, their ability, their businesses on the ground, their ability to actually create jobs. Because if you create jobs and livelihood for people in distant communities, and you do that for everyone, you have the chance to build a new community where people can thrive together.
Thank you very much, Per. Very, very important points to take away, which I will try and sum up at the end of this panel. And I'm looking at the time with great horror because we have 11 minutes left. So we can all blame the World Humanitarian Forum for not having given us enough time to really dig into these issues in much more detail, because they deserve far more detail. But I'm going to have to ask you all to wrap up with a few closing remarks. If there's anything that has been said that you would like to pick up on specifically, I'd like to start maybe with Kelly to come back to some of the protection challenges, of course, that a protection agency like UNHCR is facing in the current context, but what you see as really the key challenges. But whatever you want to focus on, be it more on the scale of the problem or on the solutions. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Alex and colleagues. I was kind of chuckling to myself with Per's description of this journey that we have been on for many years, and he's been very kind. I know that there has also been frustration in trying to maneuver around a large multilateral organization as the IKEA Foundation has done exceptionally well. So it has been a good partnership. I also think that some of what we're talking about, particularly on the solution side, and some of these initial learnings in places like Dolado, in Kakuma, for example, with Vodafone and some other partners on the learning side and so on. Some of these early learnings have basically been the basics of the compact. You know, in terms of the partnership, many that are watching this program, certainly you on the screen know how deep the relationship now has become with some of the international financial institutions. The recognition of the World Bank in terms of forced displacement, fragile communities and countries as places where they need to invest further. And that is where I think these, the point that was made earlier by Per, that these are long-term investments in partnerships, but also in communities and in countries. And when we're talking about a place like Bangladesh, to go back to Sherrie's point, working with the Bangladesh government in terms of how you can develop programs that assist the refugees in those camps, but also the host community that may equally be in need of education for their children. These are very important steps that we can take in terms of solutions and incentivize collaboration, which could be otherwise very difficult to achieve. I think I wouldn't want to leave this conversation, Alex, without just a touch on some of the protection issues that we're most concerned about now. And it gets again back to education and risks of sexual and gender-based violence, particularly now, particularly when communities and some individuals that we protect and aid are not as accessible. And this is where we need to use the kind of partnerships we have with the private sector and some of the technologies that have been nascent. We're scaling up in terms of the communication elements, and we don't have time to go into this now, but that we need to redouble efforts considerably. When you see 5.6 million refugees now out of school, to go with that larger number of learners that are not learning now, and you add that to 2.8 refugees that were already out of school, and this goes beyond the early learners that Sherrie talked about to the primary and secondary, the population, the group of kids that we're most worried about are girls. The chances of sexual work, of child marriage, of violence outright are quite great. So I think the longer this goes on, and unless we pay attention to all facets of what we're trying to do in terms of the people that we're serving, we are going to see people left behind. But thanks again for shining a spotlight on this.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Francesco, would you like to add a few closing remarks?
But just first, echoing what Kelly just said in his closing remarks, and adding how it's important, just stressing the point how important to engage with the communities. I repeated as a mantra in this panel how concerned I am, and I think that this is the most important point, to have access to the most vulnerable, to implement the policies. I think it is important to work at community level and change the narrative, the toxic narrative that is accompanying the life of migrants, refugees in the places where they arrive. It's so difficult for everyone. It's not an easy task to leave their own roots, where you belong since when you were born, and they are forced to, for several reasons. I don't want to repeat them, but I've stated at the beginning. So it's just about to engage and to explain and to make the communities and to recognize the human beings, about naming refugees or migrants or IDPs, the human beings, and that they must be treated with dignity. This is the other aspect, dignity. It's too often is a forgotten word in the policies, in the way we approach, in the way we discuss, we engage. Not we, of course, as humanitarians, but we as at community level. And this is something that I think is extremely important. Changing the narrative and restoring the dignity. And this is the heart of the Red Cross Red Crescent action. So thank you again, Alexandra, and all to other colleagues for the opportunity to have this time together.
Thank you, Francesco. Sherrie, over to you for a few final words.
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, no one will be surprised that my final words would still focus on those children, particularly the most vulnerable, on those who are displaced. But I think it's so interesting that the face of COVID-19 has not been children, because they are less likely to have severe disease from the coronavirus than adults. But if you really think of the largest disruption of education in the world, over 1.5 billion children out of school, I do believe the greatest impact is going to be on children. And while many countries have focused on distance learning, but about 40% have not focused on early learning. And I believe we have to focus on education overall if we're going to build back, or if we're going to make progress on any of the SDGs. Bill Gates said recently in his annual report that progress is possible, but not inevitable. And by investing in education, and particularly early education, and making sure we are not leaving the most marginalized children, the most vulnerable, and those who are affected by conflict and displacement, then I don't see how we can make progress on any of those goals. So as you would expect, I feel like the most important thing we can do is make sure that everyone is including in their COVID response and beyond education, and not leaving the youngest behind.
Critical points, Sherrie. Thank you so much. Final few words from you, Per.
Well, I wanted to echo again Franco's point about the narrative, because we can all do something to change the narrative, and I think that's also an area where business can play a very important role. The example for IKEA, for example, the business, which has little to do with the foundation, the business has committed to create 2,500 internships, jobs for refugees in Europe and North America. That's in addition to actually helping change the narrative. And if we can change the narrative, we won't have a problem, because with the fertility rates going on in Europe right now, we will need many more migrants to actually come to Europe to do the jobs, to take care of the old people like myself in the future. So we won't have a numbers problem in a few years. But let me just close by saying that I think we have a chance to do things much better, and we have a chance to get it right. And I know we can do it, but we can only do it if we collaborate and work together. We can take down the barriers, we can find new and improved ways of doing things, and we can create a healthy future for children, as Sherrie is pointing out, because children are the future. But we have to learn from COVID-19 so we can be better prepared for the impact of the climate crisis, because the worse the climate crisis becomes, the more disasters we will face, and the more people will be forced to flee their homes in search of safety. So I'd like to close with a IKEA founder word, the great Ingvar Kamprad. He always used to say, a crisis brings out the best in us. So let's use that as an opportunity. And he always ended by saying that most things remain to be undone. So most things remain to be done. A beautiful future. That was his motto, and that took him a long way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Per. You do have some beautiful quotes up your sleeve. Thanks a lot. I have just a couple of minutes to thank you all for your participation on this panel. I think it's been hugely rich. We've covered a lot of ground. It would have been great to have more time to dig a little deeper, but I will try my best to just very quickly summarize everything that was said and discussed. I think we have touched quite well on the scale of the phenomenon that we are facing right now. It is a phenomenon of displacement and migration that is very much global in nature, that is multi-causal. It is not just linked to one issue of conflict or insecurity or political instability. It is far-reaching and anchored in some of the biggest structural challenges that we face, from climate change to inequality, to governance, etc. And it has, of course, multiple impacts. We talked about the very urgent impacts that we're seeing on women and children across the world. And we've also talked about the much more protracted impacts, the tip of the iceberg of which we can already see today, but that we can only expect to grow in size and scale in the future. Kelly, you reminded us all of the importance of monitoring the protection risks faced by many vulnerable communities across the world, and particularly, Sherrie, I think a very important reminder that children should be at the center of our thinking, because we need to prepare the world for the next generation. We've also looked at, of course, the current sort of global threats that we're facing in the form of course, this global pandemic, but also climate change, which we all know is only likely to exacerbate or render more severe some of these impacts in the future. So unless we start investing now in reducing these risks, we can only expect the trends that we're seeing today to increase in the future. On a more positive note, I think we did touch on a lot of interesting ideas for solutions that can be found, of course, in the power of partnership, private, public, local, international. I think there's been a lot of really interesting points made about the importance of learning and cross-fertilization, the sharing of good practice, and the informing or the design of programs and new approaches that are, or the informing of new approaches with the experience of successful programs from across the world. We've also talked, Francesco, you were very clear that we needed to focus on inclusive approaches. There's too much exclusion of local actors, you were saying, but in general, I think there are a lot of proven successes of involving local communities and developing or designing inclusive and integrated approaches from the outset. And I think as a community, we need to get better at thinking much more automatically in an inclusive way. And that linked to that, we talked about how to incentivize collaboration and partnership to reach these inclusive approaches. And then finally, a couple of points on the need for long-term investments. I think we all face the challenge of often thinking according to sort of humanitarian timeframes and budgets and mandates, but of course we need to think long-term. This is much more of a long-term issue that is going to affect future generations, and so it is going to need a lot of time and of course financial investment, but also temporal investment. And then the final point that I'm afraid we didn't spend enough time on was this issue of the narrative, how to change the narrative around displacement and migration, to kind of refocus, as you were saying, Francesco, on people's dignity. Perhaps that could be the subject of a next panel, who knows. But I think, yes, taking down the barriers, as Per was saying, and shifting the way in which people think, talk about the issue, and ultimately act in favor of it.
I think we should reconvene. We'll have to reconvene.
So, yes.
There's so much to say there.
With pleasure. Thank you so much to all of you. It is 17:03 here in Geneva. So I haven't completely messed up as a moderator, it would seem. So I appreciate your very insightful comments and the fact that you all stuck to time. So thanks to all of you, to the World Humanitarian Forum, for organizing this event. And have a good rest of the day, all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. Thank you all. Thank you.